Hello everyone, this is Speaker Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be my spoiler review of Spider-Man No Way Home. Now you can check out my more formal non-spoiler review within the channel, and I will leave a link within the description. Now this video will be far more of a free discussion where I talk about what I felt were the most standout elements throughout the movie. Now there will likely be spoilers for previous movies within the Marvel Cinematic Universe and also the previous Spider-Man films, Spider-Man Homecoming and also Spider-Man Far From Home. So just beware when going on to this overall video. Now there's so much to talk about throughout this film, so I'll try and be concise as I can. So then straight away then I'll talk about what everybody has been asking ever since the plot of this film was released. We all knew that we'll be seeing previous villains from previous Spider-Man films, so logically we would assume that we would also see previous actors from those films who played Spider-Man, Toby Maguire and Andrew Garfield. Will they be appearing in this movie, and if so, in what capacity? So the quick answer is yes, they do appear, and I actually have to give credit here because they have far more of a substantial role than what I thought they would be. When it was announced or predicted very much that they would be appearing, I really felt this was going to be a quick fan service 5-minute appearance where essentially Peter Parker, the Tom Holland version, would be losing the final battle, and then both Toby and Andrew would appear, very similar as what we saw in the final battle of Endgame, if you remember, when we saw all of the Marvel characters appearing. We had that famous line, "On your left," by Falcon appearing alongside Captain America. That's what I thought we were going to get here. I thought it was just going to be a quick 5-minute cameo, and then they would go way back to their respective universes. Now I can actually give them credit here because they have a far more of a substantial appearance and actually a more integral role in terms of the overall character of Peter Parker, the Tom Holland version, than what I thought. They managed to really make it as if they were far more important, and therefore I don't deem it as fan service, because fan service in its more typical form is when, like I said, it's just a quick cameo appearance. It doesn't really mean anything. You could have taken him out of the film and he still could have had the overall story. That's not what we got here, so I give them credit here. So in terms of how they appear, it happens 3/4 of the way through the movie where essentially Ned and MJ are looking for Peter Parker, and Ned has the ring, I believe, from Doctor Strange, and he's trying to basically wish that he could see Peter Parker, and he inadvertently creates a portal, as what we see from Doctor Strange, and they're looking in the distance and they see Peter Parker in his costume from the background, so they're calling out to him because they think it's their friend, and we see him walking together, and I can vividly remember the crowd was really screaming and cheering at this point, because as he walks towards the portal you can clearly see that it's not the Tom Holland version, so everybody was just cheering because they felt this is the moment. I think they believed it's going to be Toby, but it actually turns out to be Andy, and he walks through the portal, he takes off his mask, and then they're asking him afterwards who he is. And we actually had some very funny scenes here because they're asking him to prove that he's Spider-Man, and they're asking him to walk on the ceiling and shoot his web. So there was actually very good humour that they generated throughout these scenes here. And then once they establish that he is indeed Spider-Man, they then weave another portal because they're trying to, again, to connect to the Tom Holland version. And then this is when we get the appearance of Toby Maguire's Spider-Man, and he walked through the portal as well. Now, to be fair, they both still look youthful. Normally, as what we've seen with previous Marvel films, when they get these classic actors to come back and reprise their roles, they generally have to do some sort of de-aging gimmickry in order to make them still youthful. But they didn't have to do that here. Both Toby and Andy still looked as the same, for the most part, as what they did with their respective movies. So credit to them, keeping themselves in shape for the most part throughout the film. Now, one query I did have is that why were they both so comfortable walking into this overall universe? We never really catch up with what exactly they were doing at the point in time as which the portal appears within their respective worlds. Why would they just willingly walk through a portal? They didn't even question it. They just generally go along with it and walk through the portal. That didn't really make sense to me. If you notice, when we get these films, so often the case, when we get a character portal appears out of nowhere, they would at least question it, right? They would at least be a bit hesitant to walk through it. But no, both Toby and Andy just willingly walk through the portal, and they never really question about it. They're more really excited in many ways to see Ned and MJ, and then later on Tom Holland's version. They never really question what's going on, why are we here. It also seemed that they didn't really have any yearning to get back to their own respective worlds. There were some lines here or there. They make reference to the fact that they were with their previous or current partners. So Peter makes reference quickly to the fact that him and MJ, I believe, are still married. And also, Andy makes reference to the fact that he was in love with someone, Gwen Stacy, if you remember, from Amazing Spider-Man 2. But that's it, really. So, in terms of the overall story, maybe they felt that they couldn't spend too long with previous versions talking about their current lifestyles and where they're at. It would just bog down the story too much, particularly at this stage of the film. And I did like all of the interplay between all three Spider-Man. They did get a good amount of screen time, sharing various jokes amongst one another. Who's the better Spider-Man? Where have you been? We had very good moments when Ned calls out Peter Parker and they all answer at once simultaneously. So they did spend a good amount of time playing on the whole concept of the three Spider-Men working together. And for the most part, this worked very well throughout the movie. It generated a lot of humour and comedy. There were times when they did walk that balance between what was entertaining and what was annoying. I think, particularly in certain scenes between Toby and Andy, they were constantly quipping against one another, all of these one-liners and jokes. It was a bit overplayed. There was that one weird scene where Toby is feeling a certain back pain and Andy has to hold him up and massage his back pain. Now, some people laughed. I didn't really generate a lot of humour for me. I just felt that moment was a bit weird. Again, didn't ruin the film overall, but I just think moments like that could have been taken out. I think sometimes the interplay did slow down the pace and momentum of the movie itself. This is when we were at a real emotional stage throughout the film. So just have a bit of banter was a bit too much at times. I think they could have toned it down a bit. I also did like the scene where essentially Peter Parker is mourning the death of Aunt May, is what we will talk about later on. And then both Toby and Andy come together and they're both reflecting about the loss of Uncle Ben. And of course that builds a connection with Tom Holland's character, who initially ignores their advice because he states, you don't know what I've gone through, but then they do know what they've gone through, obviously. So there was actually a lot of scenes that carried a lot of emotional weight to it, and I think they played this really well. And like I said, this is where I credit the movie so much for not just turning Toby and Andy in just to fan service cameos. We had various callbacks to the previous two Spider-Man films. So, of course, we had the pivotal moment, as what we saw in the trailer, where we see Zendaya's MJ falling off the scaffolding, and many people felt it would be Tom Holland that would save her. But what happens here is that Tom Holland's version dives down to save her, and then the Green Goblin glider collides with him, and then as she's falling, it's then Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man that goes to save her. And of course, this was a callback to the climatic ending of Amazing Spider-Man 2, when they followed the comic book storyline when Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man fails to save Gwen Stacy and she falls to her death. So that was very much more of a redemptive moment. And then we see Andy Garfield holding Zendaya and there are tears flowing through his eyes. And I can remember there were loads of people in the cinema really welling up at this point. And yeah, it did hit a big emotional beat. We had another cyclical moment when we had a climatic fight between Tom Holland's Spider-Man and the Green Goblin. And Tom Holland's Spider-Man goes to smash down the glider amongst Green Goblin, and then it's Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man that holds him back. So again, this is very much, I believe, more of a passing of the mantle in many ways. You had the original or the first cinematic version of Spider-Man passing on the lesson to the current version, stating that no, this is not the way. You don't kill no matter what the motivation or no matter what the cost. And again, I felt this was a very good moment. And then we did get a shocking moment when the Green Goblin stabs the Tobey Maguire version, but he wasn't died, he just managed to recover from his wounds. And again, that did elicit a lot of shocks and gasps from the audience as well. So they did generate a lot of emotional weight and feeling towards both the involvement of both Toby and Andy. And I think overall, if you were somebody who was majorly anticipating their return, as what most people were throughout this movie, I think you would be satisfied. And I think this is a good lesson in many ways going forward. If you're going to see further franchise continuations or rebooting and they want to use previous characters, then this is the right way to do it. You have many fan service moments and references, but at the same time, you make them integral to the storyline, and they did that very well for both Toby and Andy throughout this movie. So we're going to talk about more emotional moments, and of course, as I mentioned before, the other big emotional moment was indeed the death of Aunt May, and I think this was very emotional and well played. So essentially what happens is we have a confrontational moment where we get the revelation of the more Green Goblin personality of Norman Osborn be revealed, and there's a big explosion throughout this building, and then we see the Norman Osborn or the Green Goblin version going to attack Peter, and we see Aunt May involved. And to be honest, it was kind of telegraphed at this point because she was too involved. She was too much showing her intent to get involved in the battle. He's going to attack Peter. I think Peter dodges his attack, and then the glider comes back and it knocks into Aunt May. So again, we're trying to go for much more of a cyclical moment because in this first Spider-Man movie, if you remember, the glider collides into Norman Osborn, and this time it collides into Aunt May. So initially what happens was Norman Osborn flies off, and then both Peter Parker and Aunt May are standing together, and you think they're okay, but you can see that she's not. But the fact that she's kind of breathing slowly, she's trying to collate her words together, so you know she's not okay, and then she slowly succumbs to her wounds. And I have to say, it was very well played from Tom Holland, and throughout this movie in general, I said in my non-spoiler review, I think he's very well performed throughout this film, and even throughout Avengers Infinity War. If you remember, we had that heartbreaking scene when we had the snap, and it was very much more of Tony Stark reflecting on Peter Parker dying. They do create the same amount of emotional intensity here when Peter Parker is mourning the loss of Aunt May. And I believe that's the same narrative of what they play in the Amazing Spider-Man 400 issue when Aunt May dies. And I believe that's the One Bad Day narrative. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. And I also like the scene where Peter Parker is standing on his own. He's looking at the broadcast of J. Jonah Jameson. And we get that great image shot, that panning away shot of where we see him from the back and he's looking at the big screen. And then both Ned and Zendaya come over to comfort him. And again, that was very much of an emotional weight moment, again, where they're hugging him and they're consoling him. And it has even more impact because we followed these characters all of the way through both the previous two films as well. So just well performed throughout this overall moment. And as I mentioned before, that plays all the way through to that climactic fight that we get with Green Goblin and Peter Parker. They really ramped up the intensity where he's throwing multiple punches as well. So again, this was something that I credit the film so much, that it really did hit hard those emotional beats throughout the film. So the other big talking point that everybody was speculating about was the involvement of Charlie Cox's Daredevil and whether he would be appearing or not within this movie. We're dealing with the fallout of Peter's identity being exposed, and they're all sitting at the dinner table, and that's where we get the walk-in entrance of Charlie Cox's Daredevil. And to be honest, it's only one scene, and this is very much more fan service in its more prime form here, because they do hint at Peter needing a lawyer, but they don't really expand on it, because really, after a couple of scenes, we see Peter is taken away and they're hiding out in a much more secure Avengers facility. So this whole idea of Peter needing somebody to defend him, maybe potentially going to trial, isn't referred to again. So this is what you would call more fan service, right? Because it has no bearing on the overall story. You could have taken out the appearance and it doesn't affect the plot in any way, shape or form. It wasn't a bad scene. Essentially, Charlie Cox just states that he needs a lawyer. We did get that good moment when somebody throws a brick through the window and then Charlie Cox catches it instantly. Peter asks him how he manages to do that and he says, "I'm a good lawyer." Now, of course, we all know he has heightened senses given his powers as Daredevil. And I suppose if you haven't watched the Daredevil series and you have no clue as to who the character is, this would raise some curiosity as to how this character will have any future involvement within the MCU. And I'll probably speculate more about Charlie Cox's Daredevil being involved within the MCU going forward in a later video. The next point I want to talk about was the battle between Doctor Strange and Spider-Man. So essentially what happened was they were collating together all of the villains that had emerged from the multiverse in some sort of underground dungeon within the Sanctorum of Doctor Strange. And for the most part, this goes about pretty smoothly. Peter manages to obtain them with ease. But after a scene between Aunt May and Norman Osborn, where basically he states that he's lost and he's looking to find himself again, Peter Parker sympathises more with all of the villains, and Doctor Strange reveals that returning them back to their current location means that they will end up dying as to what they did within the original films. And Peter doesn't want to do that. He wants to find another way. So he takes the original box device that Doctor Strange was going to use to reverse the spell, and then that's when we get a interesting chase sequence between both Doctor Strange and Spider-Man. Now, don't get me wrong, on the one hand, this was a fabulous scene in terms of the special effects, where we basically, Doctor Strange is trying to apprehend Spider-Man through all of the portals. We've seen this in the trailer when Spider-Man is trying to swing through and Doctor Strange is making all the portals swing back Spider-Man to the original location. We get that great scene what we saw from the trailers where Doctor Strange pushes Spider-Man from his original physical form into that more astral projection. We've seen that so many times through both the Doctor Strange movies and Infinity War as well. But the one thing I question is that Peter Parker was still able to control his body outside of his physical form, and even Doctor Strange asks that as well. So again, in terms of this movie, I question that, but maybe we'll get much more of an explanation when we come across to the Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. So it was a superb sequence, but I just questioned, why is Doctor Strange struggling so much to handle Spider-Man? Because at the end of the day, just in terms of sheer power abilities and scale, Spider-Man can't even compare to Doctor Strange. There were probably about 1,001 different ways Doctor Strange could have easily stopped Spider-Man. Maybe he could have turned the environment into water or vacuum to stop Spider-Man swinging everywhere, but he was really struggling to get a hold of Spider-Man. Now, I do understand in terms of the story, we've got to make it more urgent, we've got to make Spider-Man prominent throughout this film. I get that, but just in terms of the overall characters, this shouldn't really have been any type of contest. And then we get that point where Peter is able to trap Doctor Strange in a universe, and he stays there, it's hinted later on, for about 12 hours. Doctor Strange really should be able to break out of this far sooner. This was, in many ways, them supporting more the story rather than the character, because they had to shift Doctor Strange out of the narrative in order to bring back Toby and Andy and have Peter spend a good amount of time with both of those characters as well. So in terms of the story, I get what they were going for, but in terms of the actual logic, it didn't really make a lot of sense. I also questioned the naivete of Peter's plan to help out the villains and put them back in their respective universes, because at the end of the day, they're still villains, and they do establish this throughout the story. They talk about what they were trying to do, how they were against Peter Parker or the Peter Parker version from their own universes. So this whole idea of trying to return the criminals back to their universes, because they're only going to cause more havoc when they get there, right? There's no way that the likes of, especially Doc Ock and Green Goblin and Electro as well, are going to go back to their universes and overall start becoming people of good. They're going to go back and cause mayhem as what they used to. So I just question that logic in terms of trying to save these criminals in many ways. And I think in terms of the villains, it was very predictable that they were going to turn at some point. Again, we already knew this because we saw it from the trailer, the final climatic battle. So they were trying to give this much more of a sympathetic, maybe potential redemptive arc for all of them, but it didn't really wash with me because I knew there was going to be some point that they would turn. And to be honest, when we get that moment, it wasn't quite convincing enough, their overall motivations. As I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, we had certain characters such as the Sandman and the Lizard, and you really question why they were there. They were kind of felt more there by the numbers. What is really their overall motivations? Their motivations was much more of a circumstance, right? They had things done to them. They weren't really trying to take over the world or destroy it. So there was no real driving motivation for them to turn. Now we can understand this with Norman Osborn and Green Goblin in many ways, because obviously that's the psychotic part of his personality. But for all the villains to turn and team up together, it didn't quite ring true. And even when we get the climatic fight and everybody is defeating one another, again, nobody is killing anybody. Everybody's kind of all forgiving and everybody's happy. And all the villains realise the error of their ways. And we see this as they disintegrate back into their ultimate universes. Again, it was just a bit too much of a back and forth where they were almost taking away the threat level, because these are the villains, but they don't want to make them too much of villains. They want to make them sympathetic, as what is always the case now with these movies. So I think they did take away some of the threat level as we went towards the overall climax. I did like the way that they did improve on the spider sense within Peter Parker. I liked the way that they ramped up the music and the tension as well. This is very key when we saw him, spider sense, always coming the way through when he was talking to Norman Osborn as he was coming into more of his Green Goblin narrative. So I did like how they played that out as well. So we then talk about the overall conclusion of this film and how everything was wrapped up. Now in my non-spoiler review, I did question that people would probably pick apart more the overall mechanics of the overall spell and indeed how the multiverse works. So of course in the beginning of this whole plot, the initial idea was to reverse people's knowledge of Peter Parker's identity as Spider-Man, and this is what caused the rift in the multiverse. So when we come to the conclusion and we see the whole multiverse surrounding the skyline, again we've seen the scene within the trailers, the ultimate answer was to make it so that nobody would know who Peter Parker was. We had those sequences when we saw the skylines opening up and then we saw various figures. I couldn't quite make out who the figures were in the sequences. I couldn't make out as if they were other villains from previous source material in terms of the comic books. I thought I saw some silhouettes of maybe some characters from Loki. Again, maybe I was missing it too much, but I couldn't make out who it was. But essentially the idea was that there were villains all over universes being drawn to Peter Parker, and Doctor Strange couldn't stop it. This does open up a lot of logical loopholes. You know, how many universes are there? Why were they all looking for Peter Parker? Why did we only get the manifestation from the movies of the Sam Raimi's and the Andrew Garfield movies, right? In terms of the overall film, it doesn't spoil the overall enjoyment, but you could question, why didn't more characters manifest themselves? Now, we have to give a bit of leeway here because we could see more appearances from characters appear later on down the line within Marvel films or indeed Sony films. And the overall resolvement was to have everybody just forget about Peter Parker's identity, and that ends up closing the spell completely. So I just found that to be a bit of a cheat. That was just an easy way to kind of resolve the storyline, and I suppose at this point where we're coming up close to 2 hours and 20 minutes, we had to wrap everything up. I just questioned the overall logic as to how in the beginning we started this spell by trying to make everybody forget he was Spider-Man, and then by resolving this spell we make everybody forget he's Peter Parker. So it didn't quite ring true to me in terms of overall logistics of how the spell works. You get those very touching moments when Peter Parker goes first of all to Toby and Andy, and he's spanking them together, and then they disintegrate into their own universes. And then we get that touch moment where he reconnects again with both Ned and MJ. He tells them exactly what he's going to do, and they ask him, make sure when you come back you remind us of who you are and you tell us exactly what happened. And then we get that very touching moment where Peter Parker goes back to normal. He walks back into the diner where MJ is working and she's talking to Ned, and then he's got a note ready because he's obviously written down everything that happened and he was going to use that to help them remember. But then he sees the plaster on MJ's head that she suffered when getting wounded in the overall final battle, and I think that was the moment when he realizes that they were actually better off not knowing who he was. They were actually more safer, and this is typical superhero storytelling that we see all the time, that the hero preserves his secret identity in order to preserve the safety of his loved one. So again, this is very predictably played, but it was a very nice moment. And on one hand you could say it's a shame because surely now this severs ties with all connections with all of the characters that we've known from indeed the home franchise very much in terms of this Spider-Man films. We had another very touching moment when Peter visits Aunt May's grave and then he meets Happy Hogan, and we get that very uncomfortable pause because Peter realizes that Happy Hogan's memory has been erased as well. So he's kind of unsure what to say because Happy doesn't know who he is, but of course he remembers who Aunt May was. So that was a very another touching moment as well. But once again, I just question this whole enterprise of erasing Peter's memories from all of the Marvel Cinematic Universe characters. Now, I did state in previous videos when previewing this film that at the overall conclusion there was going to be some sort of initiative or reversing of events that would result in very much separating Peter Parker from the MCU, because as we all know, Sony has been building over its own individual Spider-Man universe centering around the iconic Spider-Man villains. So at some stage, Sony, who owns the character, would eventually want to take full control over the Spider-Man so they could use it to build their own universe. But at the same time, they also understand that the Spider-Man MCU version is the true moneymaker. This was emphasized when Far From Home made $1 billion. So they want to retain that association, but at the same time be able to move creatively on their own. So this whole event of reversing the spell or initiating the spell that everybody forgets about Peter Parker is very much Sony and indeed Marvel trying to have it both ways. On the one hand, they want to be able to operate on their own with the character, but at the same time, they're still keeping him within the wheelhouse of the MCU. So in one way, they can have these standalone adventures, but whenever they want to, they can reconnect with the Marvel characters. Now, to be honest, I'm not quite sure that this completely follows through properly because, again, you're going to have audiences still confused because you're still using Tom Holland. So even though you've used the spell, he still has a huge association with the MCU characters. This is partly what makes him so popular, right? Is all of his interactions, first of all, with Tony Stark, and then with Happy Hogan, and also with Nick Fury. So you've severed all ties with that. So how much are the MCU fans going to continue with this Tom Holland version if he has no connection at all with all of the Marvel characters? How well are Sony going to be able to carry on with a Spider-Man that has no connection at all with the Marvel characters? What happens if they fail within any standalone issues? They're then going to have to revert back to connect with the Marvel characters? Now, in some way, people could argue, well, this could still work because we've had many storylines throughout the comics and indeed the animated series where Peter Parker very much is more of an independent operator. He still interacts with the Avengers at some stage, but he's still very much his own person. This is very much more of a closing off of a trilogy arc of this stage of Peter Parker, the high school Peter Parker, the student who has to very much balance his superhero life with his school life. So now we've come to the closure of that particular arc. Now going forward, we're going to go more into the adult version of the Peter Parker, the freelance photographer Peter Parker, the Peter Parker who lives on his own in his apartment. We see those climatic scenes at the end, again referring back to the source material where he's knitting the original Spider-Man costume. We've done away now with the Iron Spider nanotech costume, which I really didn't like overall. So this is going back more to the more classic original version of Spider-Man, and I think in many ways they were trying to appease fans who always had the problem with this iteration of Spider-Man, the fact that he was much more of an Iron Spider-Boy, the fact that he has the nanotech suit and it puts him in various combat phases, the whole really integral part of Spider-Man that he very much can function on his own. He doesn't rely on any technology or gadgets aside from the web shooters. He's just able to function on his own. So that's what they were trying to hint at here. So I get it. I get the whole narrative. I get the whole cyclical knowledge that they were going for here in terms of trying to revert more to the original Spider-Man. I just question the overall mechanics in terms of having everybody forget about him. At the end of the day, you will have various school records and pictures and files of Peter Parker, whether it'll be from his college, whether it'll be from the Avengers themselves. So you're wiping away all of that. You're making everybody forget about who he is. Doesn't that in many ways eliminate the whole existence of both Homecoming and Far From Home, right? So when we go back to revisit those films, in many ways those films don't matter now, because at the end of the day everybody's going to forget about who he is. I also have to question quickly, and this is more of a nitpick on my part, why exactly didn't they have Peter Parker in a full frontal shot of his new costume? Then we have that final sequence, he's swinging and we get those close-up shots of him, so you can't really make out what it is in the costume. So that was a bit of a disappointment. So that's it really in terms of the overall film itself and all of the elements that I thought were stand out throughout the film. We then go on to the end credit scene. So we had two, and the first one we catch up with Eddie Brock as Venom, and he's drunk within a bar, and we see him talking to the bartender. And if you know, there was some sort of hints at the end credit scene of Venom Let There Be Carnage that Venom was indeed transported, I believe, to the MCU. So here he's getting drunk and he's talking about the Spider-Man and Incredible Hulk and all of the Avengers, and it's really played more for laughs. And then we see at the end that he gets transported. So from what I can make out, I believe he's getting transported back to his other universe, the Sony universe, I believe. And then at the end you see on the bar there's a segment of the Venom symbiote being left over. So are we then saying that there's going to be a different type of Venom that plays within the MCU? Again, this goes back to my previous comments. Is this a case of where Marvel indeed wants to use a version of Venom in their own Spider-Man universe, and then Sony can still continue with the Tom Hardy version within their own universe? Is that a way? Because why would you leave a segment of the symbiote left there if you're saying that the Tom Hardy version is the established Venom? So again, this is where, as I mentioned before, Marvel and Sony have to really be careful if we're indeed going to introduce this multiverse and we're going to have multiple versions of the same character crossing over to audiences. Maybe have movies in the same year from Sony and Marvel as well. So they've really got to be careful how they play this overall. But in terms of this overall end credit scene, I think it was just leaving open and suggesting again that we may get another symbiote going forward, and also that eventually we've cleared the decks in many ways by severing all of the attachments of Tom Holland's Spider-Man from the MCU characters. They've now left it more open so that he can interact with Venom, which is what Sony wants. They obviously want that movie where you've got Tom Holland's Spider-Man and Tom Hardy's Venom together in the movie, because they believe that will make them the most money, and eventually we'll see Tom Holland's Spider-Man interact a lot more with the villains established already in Sony's Spider-Verse. So that's what they're going for within this end credit scene. So very good end credit scene in terms of the overall questions it poses. Now for me and a lot of people, the far more interesting and more hype footage was the second end credits. And this didn't turn out to be an end credit scene, but actually it turned out to be a full-on trailer for Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. And this was amazing, because when we saw the sequence play out, first of all, I thought it was only a couple of scenes, but then the footage kept going and it kept going and it kept going, and I thought, wow, this is absolutely incredible. And again, everybody was stunned throughout the cinema as to actually what they were witnessing on screen. Now, due to the fact that this is quite a lengthy video already, I'm not going to go into the overall details of this trailer. I'll do that in another video. So it wouldn't surprise me if we do indeed shortly see a full HD version of the trailer released online, because it's already out everywhere. And by this time now, especially, people will already know that the trailer is released. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see a full-on trailer. So when we get a far more of a HD resolution version of the trailer that's released, then I will do a full-on breakdown of this Multiverse of Madness trailer. But just in short, I think it looked absolutely incredible. And if you think there was a lot of hype surrounding No Way Home, then I think there's going to be even more hype surrounding Doctor Strange, the Multiverse of Madness. So much to talk about, so much going on, particularly the final shot at the end. So that's really got me most excited in terms of this overall experience, and I really can't wait now to what we see overall in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness when it arrives. I think in theatres around March 2022. That's it then. That's my overall thoughts and feelings and spoiler review of Spider-Man No Way Home. Let me know what you think in the comments below. What elements stood out for you most throughout this overall movie? If I've missed out any key scenes or features, then let me know in the comments. And if I've missed out anything truly significant, then I will do a further supplementary video. And as usual, when we get to the first box office numbers in terms of its opening weekend, I will provide further commentary about that. I will also provide commentary on the Multiverse of Madness trailer, and also maybe do further speculation as when the MCU goes next moving forward in terms of the overall 5-year time jump, the multiverse event, and also how exactly will they manage to balance the now separated Tom Holland Spider-Man going forward in terms of the Sony universe and the MCU as well. Please also hit and like the subscription buttons and notifications so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay in safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.